Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed reflecting on Aristotle's understanding of the good life so far in this unit. In our last lecture, we examined Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, or human happiness, and his view that the pursuit of happiness is fundamentally tied to our ability to reason and the pursuit of virtue. We analyzed Aristotle's function argument and explored the key relationship that he draws there between our rational nature and our social nature. In this first part of Lecture 6, we will build on these central ideas and consider some further crucial aspects of Aristotle's ethical thought. First, after a brief recap of some of the core points of Aristotle's view of eudaimonia, we'll discuss his views on the fragility of the good life. Despite having a clear vision of what eudaimonia involves, Aristotle also realizes that various factors can undermine it, which leads him to consider the role of politics and what he calls external goods in living well. This will get us to examine why Aristotle thinks politics and political inquiry generally is indispensable when investigating the good life. Next, we'll explore how Aristotle believes virtues are formed. We've already noted his view that virtues are central to living a good life, but how do we develop them? Aristotle has an interesting answer. We cultivate virtue through habituation, similar to how we gain expertise in a craft. Finally, in this video, we'll discuss Aristotle's particularist approach to ethics, which resists simple, one-size-fits-all rules in favor of a nuanced understanding of ethical situations. So let's get started. In our last lecture, we introduced the concept of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, which is the ultimate and inclusive end that's the purpose of all human activities for Aristotle. Think of eudaimonia here as an umbrella concept that encompasses the unique goals of a variety of life paths. This concept serves as the overarching goal for all of our other goals, according to Aristotle, in the sense that it provides a framework that's both explanatory and informative. On this view, eudaimonia is what we all implicitly aim for, not as a means to some other end, but as the end in itself that gives meaning to our lives. We also distinguish between our contemporary understanding of happiness and Aristotle's understanding of happiness. For many of us today, happiness is about subjective feelings of well-being, or having a cheerful disposition. However, Aristotle's notion of happiness as eudaimonia is more expansive. It's not about how you feel in any given moment, it's about the quality of your life as a whole. According to this view, happiness is not merely a state of feeling good, it's about human flourishing, living in a way that fulfills your potential and gives your life direction. For Aristotle, eudaimonia encapsulates a life that is not just pleasant, but deeply meaningful, unique to each individual, while also having a universal character. Finally, we examined in our last lecture Aristotle's function argument, which culminates in an account of eudaimonia as rational activity in accordance with virtue. We considered a potential issue for this view. How does Aristotle connect our rational capacities with the pursuit of virtue? The key lies in Aristotle's understanding of humans as both rational and political animals. We exist in communities, engage in shared activities, take on various social roles, and navigate these roles through reasoning with others. This social context is where virtues like justice and courage come into play. For Aristotle, acting virtuously is not simply a matter of moral etiquette. Virtues are essential skills that enable us to thrive in our social interactions. In this way, reason and virtue are not separated for Aristotle, but interconnected elements in our efforts to live well. So we now know that the good life for Aristotle is rational activity in accordance with virtue. But are reason and virtue all that's required to live a good life? Well, next we'll explore an often overlooked aspect of Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, the role of external goods. Aristotle acknowledges that while happiness primarily consists in the perfection of our reason, achieving this ultimate goal depends on having the right external conditions in place. As he says in Book 1, Chapter 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, in the quote you see here, happiness, or eudaimonia, apparently needs external goods to be added, since it's impossible, or not easy, to do fine things without resources. For just as we perform many actions by means of instruments, we perform many by means of friends, wealth, and political power. What Aristotle is recognizing here is the fragility of the good life. It's hard, if not impossible, to live well without some degree of external goods. Goods such as financial security, political rights, and friends. Now, this is not to say that we should orient our lives around the pursuit of wealth and power for Aristotle. He still emphasizes the priority of virtue in his theory of the good life. The point is not to accumulate more and more external goods, but to use them virtuously. These external goods serve as instruments for virtuous activity. If you don't use them well, you won't live well. The goal is not simply to possess wealth, but to use it moderately. Not simply to secure political power, but to employ it wisely. Not simply to have friends, but to treat them kindly. While external goods are necessary for a flourishing life, then, they're not sufficient in themselves for Aristotle. Their value is dependent on our ability to use them well, in a manner consistent with virtuous action. So Aristotle believes that external goods are instrumental in living a good life. But this raises a fundamental question. How do these external goods come about? Who makes sure that they're distributed in a way that enables virtuous living for everyone? This is where the work of politics comes into play for Aristotle. In the images on the right, you see manifestations of problems like child poverty, environmental degradation, and the historical fight for the right to vote. These are not just ethical problems, they're also and primarily socio-political problems. Living a good life, in Aristotle's view, isn't just a matter of individual choice or virtue, it also depends on the kind of society you live in. If this is right, the pursuit of eudaimonia at the personal level requires good leaders, laws, and institutions at the political level. You can't really separate self-work from socio-political work. They go hand in hand. Aristotle himself observes this interdependency at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says, "So, since our predecessors have left the subject of legislation unexamined, it is presumably better if we ourselves investigate it, and indeed constitutions generally, so that as far as possible, our philosophy of human affairs may be brought to completion." Applying this principle to our world today, the point is that we all need to get involved in our communities, to be informed about the issues that affect us, to deliberate with one another about political outcomes, and yes, to get out and vote. Civics isn't a separate domain from ethics. It's an extension of it. It's about creating the conditions under which each individual can strive for eudaimonia. We need external conditions in place then to develop virtue for Aristotle. But assume that they're in place. Let's now pivot to explore another crucial aspect of Aristotle's ethical thought, the development of virtue from within. To better understand his approach here, it's useful to compare his ethical theory with the views of his philosophical predecessors, Socrates and Plato. Socrates' view historically seems to have been that we all inherently desire what's good for us. In this framework, virtue is fundamentally a kind of knowledge, a knowledge of what's beneficial. In many of Plato's early dialogues, Socrates argues that if you know what's good for you, you'll naturally act in accordance with that knowledge. Later on in his dialogues, like the Republic, it seems Plato himself forms a different view. We've seen how he argues in Book 4 of the Republic that knowing what's good isn't sufficient for virtuous action. This is because we can know what's good for us and still find ourselves conflicted. Remember here the case of wanting to drink and not wanting to drink at the same time. For Plato, virtue requires the shaping of one's desires, aligning them with what we understand to be good. However, he thinks this shaping is still primarily an intellectual process. It involves dialogue, philosophical inquiry, and the training of the soul through dialectic and education, as we saw in the cave allegory in Book 7 of the Republic. Aristotle, in turn, builds on Plato but places a much greater emphasis on action. For Aristotle, virtue isn't something that exists in the realm of ideas or the intellect. It's a state of character that needs to be trained through consistent action. He emphasizes the importance here of habituation, the practice of repeatedly performing virtuous actions until they become a stable part of one's character. So while Aristotle draws on Plato's views, he also diverges from him. Another way in which Aristotle draws inspiration from Plato is by making human psychology the starting point of his ethical vision. However, there are some key differences between the two philosophers' views in moral psychology. Plato, as you may recall, divides up the human psyche according to what motivates us. There's reason, or the wisdom-loving part of us, spirit, or the honor-loving part, and appetite, or the pleasure-loving part. This tripartite division of the soul corresponds to different kinds of desires within us that can conflict. And for Plato, the good life consists in a harmonious arrangement between the three parts, with justice understood as a regulating principle balancing the desires of each part of the soul. Aristotle takes a different tack. He comes up with a more biological division of the human psyche into the rational, the appetitive or subrational, and the vegetative or non-rational parts. The rational part is where our deliberative faculties reside. It's the part of us that thinks, reasons, and makes judgments. The appetitive part of the psyche includes our powers of sense perception, desires, and emotions. And the vegetative part is responsible for automatic processes in us like digestion and respiration. For Aristotle, virtuous activity primarily involves the relationship between the rational and appetitive parts of the soul. He believes that our desires and emotions can be trained to fall into line with our rational judgments. This is where the concept of habituation comes in. Virtue, for Aristotle, is about consistent, reasoned action that aligns the appetitive part of the soul with the rational part. To elaborate on this, consider the following quote from Book 1, Chapter 13 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Another natural constituent of the soul, Aristotle says, also seems to be non-rational, although it shares in reason in a way. Apparently then the non-rational part is also twofold, since the vegetative part does not share in reason in any way, but the appetitive part, indeed the desiring part as a whole, does share in reason in some way, because it is able to listen to reason and obey it. On this view, the desires and emotions that reside in the appetitive part of the soul are not opposed to reason. As Aristotle says, they seem non-rational, but we should think of them more accurately as sub-rational, because, as he says, our desires and emotions share in reason in a way, and listen to reason. So, while both Plato and Aristotle agree that virtue involves the training of the soul, their understandings of the soul's structure and its role in developing virtue diverge. Aristotle offers a more action-oriented ethical theory as part of a more naturalistic framework, emphasizing the interplay and calibration of our rational and appetitive powers. Having discussed the nature of the soul, according to Aristotle, let's now consider how it is exactly we calibrate our souls to develop virtue. Aristotle draws an analogy here between virtue and craft. Just like a craftsperson becomes skilled in their craft through repeated practice, virtue too is acquired through consistent action. And this is an idea that's clearly stood the test of time. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, has famously said, "I'd like to be known as the big Aristotle." It was Aristotle who said excellence is not a singular act, but a habit. This captures the essence of Aristotle's approach to developing virtue. It's about turning good actions into a sort of habit, something that we become naturally disposed to do from a stable state of character. Aristotle puts it this way himself in Book 2, Chapter 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Hence, the virtues come about in us neither by nature nor against nature. Rather, we are naturally receptive of them and are brought to completion through habit. But Aristotle doesn't stop there. In Chapter 2 of Book 2, he goes on to elaborate on how the virtuous person is disposed to act in the right way in the various situations they encounter. This involves avoiding both excess and deficiency, not just in our actions, but also in our feelings. Here we see a hint of the importance of Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean, which we'll cover in the next part of this lecture. Another key point that speaks to the analogy of virtue as a craft for Aristotle is his claim that the exercise of virtue is not about isolated acts. It's about a complete life, a holistic approach that permeates our actions in general. You can see this again in the Shaquille O'Neal quote. In the same way a superstar athlete exhibits excellence in their entire playing career, not just at isolated moments or in 1 or 2 games, so the road to virtue for Aristotle is a long one, requiring consistent, reasoned action that turns into habit, shaping our character over the course of a lifetime. So Aristotle's basically saying here that practice makes permanent. And again, this is an idea that we can appreciate in many different areas today. It holds true whether we're talking about a rock star owning the stage or an Olympic gymnast executing a flawless routine. Both of these individuals have spent countless hours honing their craft. It's not just about one performance or one competition, it's about a lifetime of dedication and practice that shapes their talent into something extraordinary. This is precisely Aristotle's point. Virtue, like any craft, requires not just occasional effort, but consistent, dedicated practice. It's about making virtue so ingrained in our being that it becomes a permanent part of who we are. Just like these experts in their fields, the virtuous person has trained and habituated themselves to consistently act and feel in the right ways. So, in exploring how to cultivate virtue in our lives, we should think of it the way a musician or an athlete think about their training. It's not about instant results, it's about a journey of becoming, a journey that turns practice into consistent action. There's one further important element of Aristotle's ethical theory here to understand. The approach to developing virtue that he puts forward in the Nicomachean Ethics isn't concerned with laying down universal rules or principles. This distinguishes Aristotle from other ethical theorists who might give you commandments or axioms to follow in acting morally. For Aristotle, ethical action is far too complicated to be reduced to a set of rules, since it's always dependent on the unique circumstances you find yourself in. Consider a straight ruler. It's rigid, inflexible, and can only measure flat surfaces accurately. But now consider a 3D object with curves and contours. The straight ruler is obviously ill-suited to this object. What you need instead is a flexible ruler, one that can adapt to the object's shape and give you a precise measurement. This metaphor illustrates Aristotle's approach to ethics. In Book 5, Chapter 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle insists that each ethical situation calls for a particular, nuanced response, much like how a flexible ruler adapts to various shapes. For Aristotle, then, the virtuous person is not someone who rigidly applies universal principles. Instead, they are sensitive to the various contexts and circumstances they find themselves in. This involves a kind of perceptual capacity, an ability to discern what the proportionate or just right response is in each situation. As philosophers put it today, Aristotle's virtue ethics is particularist. It respects the complexity and variability of human life. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to living well. Rather, the good life is about developing a nuanced, flexible understanding of virtue that enables us to navigate the rich tapestry of ethical situations we encounter. Now, you may have worries about this approach as well. Isn't it too imprecise? Aristotle seems to be prescribing a sort of Goldilocks ethics. Don't do too much, but don't do too little. Is there any other guidance that he can give us on how to develop a virtuous character? How will we even know when we've developed our ethical perception well enough? Hold on to these questions, which we'll return to in the next part of this lecture. That brings us to the end of the first part of Lecture 6. Let's review what we've covered in this video. First, we discussed why Aristotle places such a high importance on politics in the pursuit of a good life. We've seen that for Aristotle, political inquiry isn't just about governance or law, it's about understanding the conditions that enable us to live well as human beings. We also discussed the concept of external goods, those material and social conditions that, while not constitutive of a good life, can certainly facilitate or impede it. Aristotle recognizes that our ability to live well is not entirely up to us. It's also shaped by the societies we live in and the resources we have available to us in becoming virtuous. Next, we explored how virtues are developed. Aristotle sees this as a form of craft, something that requires practice, refinement, and above all, habituation. Virtue is not simply about knowing what's right, but about training ourselves to desire and choose the right actions. This training for Aristotle involves actions and feelings. Virtue, he thinks, is about doing the right thing and feeling the right way about it, a point we'll return to in the next video. Finally, we noted Aristotle's particularism, his belief that ethical rules can't be too rigid or universal. For Aristotle, the right action often depends on an ability to see what to do in specific circumstances, requiring us to develop a kind of ethical perception. I hope this discussion's deepened your understanding of Aristotle's ethical thought and its relevance for our lives today. In the next part of Lecture 6, we'll explore further the intricacies of Aristotle's views on virtue and how we develop virtue. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.